The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as Officer Dylan Carter slowly cruised in his patrol car. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his grip firm on the steering wheel. For Dylan, a young and ambitious officer, this was a routine patrol, a chance to uphold order, maintain safety, and, in his mind, ensure nothing out of place went unnoticed. As he rounded a corner, he spotted an older black man walking briskly along the sidewalk, carrying a small canvas bag. The man's movements seemed hurried, though unsteady, his steps faltering slightly as he approached the crosswalk. Dylan slowed the car. His mind, shaped by years of training and whispers among colleagues, leaped to suspicion. "This street's quiet at this time," Dylan muttered to himself, pulling to a stop. "What's he in such a rush for?" He rolled down his window. "Hey, sir," he called, his voice firm but polite. The man stopped, turning with an expression that mixed caution and weariness. "Yes, officer," the man asked, clutching his bag tighter. His voice was calm, though there was a slight tremor in his tone. "Mind telling me where you're headed in such a hurry?" Dylan stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively resting on his belt where his radio and other tools were clipped. The man frowned slightly but answered, "I'm just going to the bus stop. I have an appointment across town." "What's in the bag?" Dylan pressed, nodding toward the canvas bag in the man's hand. "Just some books and documents," the man said, his tone now edged with irritation. "Is there a problem, officer?" Dylan's eyes narrowed. His mind raced with protocol and possibility. Suspicion gnawed at him as he stepped closer, his voice hardening. "Would you mind setting the bag down? I need to take a look." "Officer, with all due respect, I don't think I've done anything wrong," the man replied, his words calm but firm. "I'm just trying to get to my bus." The tension in the air thickened. Dylan's patience thinned as his training clashed with an unspoken, inherited prejudice he hadn't yet confronted. "Sir, I need you to comply." The man sighed heavily and placed the bag on the ground. He raised his hands slightly, palms outward, a gesture of surrender mixed with frustration. "There's nothing dangerous in there, I assure you." Dylan stepped forward, reaching for the bag, but a noise behind him, a car horn, momentarily startled him. In his haste, he misinterpreted the man's shift in posture as resistance. "Step back!" Dylan barked, his voice rising. Without thinking, his hand moved to his baton. Before either could process the moment, Dylan shoved the man backward. The old man stumbled, his back hitting the pavement with a sickening thud. "Officer," a voice shouted from across the street. A young woman ran toward them, her face a mix of panic and anger. Dylan turned, his heart pounding, realizing what he had just done. The man on the ground groaned, clutching his shoulder as pain rippled through his body. Dylan's training kicked in, but not in the way he expected. His immediate thought wasn't to assist the man, it was to assess the situation, to prepare a justification. "Sir, are you all right?" Dylan asked, his voice louder now, an attempt to appear in control. The man looked up at him, his eyes filled with equal parts pain and disbelief. "I was just trying to catch my bus," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The young woman reached them, her phone already recording. "You can't do that," she shouted. "He didn't do anything wrong." Dylan's chest tightened as the weight of the situation began to sink in. His eyes darted to the phone, then back to the man on the ground. Around him, the street felt quieter, as though the world were holding its breath. An ambulance was called, and as the paramedics arrived to assist the man, Dylan stood frozen, his mind racing. His actions replayed in his head, but no matter how he tried to rationalize them, a sinking feeling told him he'd crossed a line. The man was loaded into the ambulance, his name muttered to the paramedics, Walter. The woman with the phone glared at Dylan before following the ambulance in her car. Dylan returned to his patrol car, his fingers trembling slightly as he gripped the wheel. For the first time in years, doubt crept into his mind. Had he misjudged the situation? Had he allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment? As he drove back to the precinct, the weight of his actions settled in his chest. He didn't know yet, but the man he had just pushed to the ground was far more than a random pedestrian. The precinct was quieter than usual when Dylan walked in, though the hum of office chatter and the occasional ring of phones filled the air. As he stepped through the corridor, he felt the weight of his actions pressing on him, heavier with every step. He tried to shake it off, but the memory of Walter's fall kept replaying in his mind like a bad dream. He reached his desk, but before he could sit, his partner, Officer Rodriguez, approached him. "Hey, I heard there was a situation on your route," Rodriguez said, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. Dylan shrugged, trying to appear unfazed. "Just a routine stop," he muttered, avoiding Rodriguez's gaze. "Doesn't sound routine." "Dispatch said EMS was involved," Rodriguez pressed. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Dylan snapped, sharper than he intended. Rodriguez raised his hands in mock surrender and walked away, but Dylan could feel his partner's lingering curiosity. He sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen, the sounds around him fading into the background. The day dragged on, punctuated by paperwork and mindless tasks that usually helped him focus. But today, nothing could distract him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Walter's face, his expression of pain and disbelief. By the time Dylan clocked out, he felt exhausted, though he hadn't done much. He drove home in silence, the hum of the car engine his only company. His usual route took him past the hospital, and tonight was no different. As he approached, he caught himself glancing toward the building, wondering about Walter's condition. "Stop it," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "You did your job." He resisted. But the words felt hollow, even as he said them. He parked in his driveway and stepped into his house, greeted by the stillness of his empty living room. The television sat in the corner, dark and silent, a reminder of how alone he often felt in these moments. Dylan dropped onto the couch, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He scrolled aimlessly, trying to distract himself, but the local news app caught his attention. The headline made his stomach drop. "Local man hospitalized after altercation with police, bystander captures incident on video." His heart pounded as he clicked the article. The footage was embedded at the top, a shaky recording of him shoving Walter to the ground. The caption beneath it read, "Witness calls for accountability as elderly man suffers injuries." He didn't press play. He didn't need to, the memory was already vivid enough. His hand trembled as he set the phone down, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and regret. Anger at the public reaction, regret for the role he played. Hours passed as Dylan sat in the dimly lit room, replaying every moment of the incident in his mind. Was Walter really resisting? Could he have handled it differently? His thoughts were interrupted by a text from his supervisor. "Meet me first thing tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the Walter Briggs incident." The text felt like a summons to judgment. Dylan tossed his phone onto the coffee table and leaned back, running a hand through his hair. His mind spiraled into questions about his career, his future, and the storm brewing around him. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emily Briggs sat by her father's bedside. Walter's arm was in a sling, and a deep bruise had formed along his temple. Though he was awake, his voice was hoarse from fatigue and pain. "Dad, you need to rest," Emily urged, adjusting his pillow. Walter smiled weakly. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little bruised ego." Emily's jaw tightened. "This isn't about ego, Dad. That officer hurt you." "And for what? Walking down the street?" Walter sighed, sensing her anger simmering beneath the surface. "I don't need you fighting my battles, Emily. This isn't just about you." Emily snapped, her voice cracking. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. What if it had been someone else? Someone without a daughter who's a doctor. What if it had been worse? Walter reached for her hand, his grip firm despite his injuries. "I know you're upset. But don't let anger consume you, Emily. That's not how we make things better." Emily pulled her hand away gently, standing to pace the room. She felt the weight of her father's words, but her frustration remained. How could he be so calm after what had happened? Her thoughts were interrupted by the nurse entering the room with an update. Walter's condition was stable, but he'd need to stay overnight for observation. Emily nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She'd make sure the world knew what had happened. Back at home, Dylan sat staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. He thought about the text from his supervisor, the video, and most of all, Walter's face. The weight of his conscience grew heavier by the minute. For the first time in his career, Dylan Carter felt truly unsure of himself. Dylan arrived at the precinct early the next morning, the weight of his supervisor's text still pressing on him. The hallways were quieter than usual, and his footsteps echoed faintly as he approached the office. His mind raced, alternating between anger at the growing scrutiny and guilt over Walter's injuries. Captain Laura Jensen was seated at her desk when Dylan entered. Her stern face barely softened as she gestured for him to sit. Dylan obliged, sinking into the chair and gripping the armrests tightly. "I'll get straight to the point," Jensen began, her voice cool and professional. "We have a problem. The video of your altercation with Walter Briggs has gone viral. The media's all over it, and the department is under fire." Dylan swallowed hard but kept his expression neutral. "Captain, I was following protocol." "Protocol?" Jensen cut him off, leaning forward. "You shoved an elderly man to the ground, Dylan. The optics alone are a nightmare, but beyond that, this incident is raising serious questions about your judgment." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't cooperating. "Save it," she said sharply. "We're launching an internal investigation, and until further notice, you're suspended with pay." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Suspended? You need to stay out of sight until this blows over," Jensen said firmly. "And I'd advise you to think long and hard about your actions. This isn't just about your career anymore." Dylan left the office in a daze. The suspension stung, but what gnawed at him more was Jensen's final comment. "This isn't just about your career anymore." Later that afternoon, Dylan found himself sitting in his living room again, his mind restless. He replayed the conversation with Jensen, followed by the incident with Walter, over and over like a broken record. He couldn't escape the feeling that his life was spiraling out of control. Out of habit, he picked up his phone and started scrolling through social media. Most of the comments about the incident were scathing, accusing him of racism and brutality. He felt a flash of anger. How could they judge him without knowing him? But then, a single comment caught his eye. "Walter Briggs is a hero in our community. That officer didn't just hurt a man, he hurt someone who's made this neighborhood better for decades." Dylan frowned. He'd assumed Walter was just another guy on the street. Who was he, really? Curiosity gnawed at him. He opened a search engine and typed Walter Briggs. Within seconds, articles and photos appeared, detailing Walter's life. He was a retired teacher who had spent years mentoring underprivileged youth in the city. He'd organized food drives, coached a local basketball team, and even helped establish a community garden in the neighborhood where Dylan's own precinct patrolled. But one article stopped him cold. It was an old feature from the local newspaper, highlighting Walter's accomplishments. In the article, Walter spoke about his daughter, Emily, and how proud he was of her becoming a doctor. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. Emily Briggs. That name sounded familiar. He closed the article and searched for Emily's name instead. His stomach twisted as the results confirmed what he feared. Dr. Emily Briggs was the ER physician who had saved his mother's life 2 years earlier. The memory came rushing back. His mother had suffered a heart attack during a family dinner, and Dylan had rushed her to the hospital. Emily had been the attending doctor, her calm demeanor and quick thinking saving his mother's life. Dylan had thanked her profusely afterward, but in the chaos of that night, he hadn't asked for her full name. Now, the connection felt like a cruel twist of fate. The father of the woman who had saved his mother's life was the same man he had injured during the altercation. A wave of nausea washed over him as the pieces fell into place. He thought of Emily, how she must have felt seeing her father in that hospital bed. The image was unbearable. Dylan set his phone down, his head in his hands. For years, he had prided himself on being a good officer, someone who protected and served his community. But now, all he could see was the harm he had caused. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his mother. "Dylan, do you remember the doctor who helped me that night? I just saw her on the news. Her father's the man from your case. You need to make this right." Dylan stared at the screen, his mother's words cutting through the fog of his guilt. Make this right. But how could he? At the hospital, Emily sat in the corner of her father's room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Walter was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Emily's phone vibrated on the side table, but she ignored it, her mind too clouded with anger and exhaustion. She replayed the incident in her head, imagining what could have happened if her father's injuries had been worse. Her hands clenched into fists at the thought. The door opened, and a nurse peeked in. "Dr. Briggs, your father's doing well. He should be ready to go home in a day or two." Emily nodded, forcing a smile. "Thank you." As the nurse left, Emily's resolve hardened. If the system wasn't going to hold Dylan Carter accountable, she would. The precinct felt different without Dylan's usual presence. His desk sat empty, a visual reminder of the controversy swirling around him. The chatter among officers was subdued, punctuated by glances toward his workspace. Dylan's absence left an unmistakable tension in the air. Meanwhile, Dylan spent his suspension restless at home. Each day felt heavier as the weight of the investigation bore down on him. He avoided his usual routines, opting to stay indoors and away from the world's judgment. Yet, he couldn't escape the articles, the social media posts, and the ongoing coverage of the incident. His phone rang late one morning, breaking his brooding silence. It was his union representative, Karen Mitchell. "Dylan, we need to prepare for your statement to Internal Affairs," Karen said, her voice brisk and professional. "They're interviewing Walter Briggs today, and we'll need to counter anything that paints you in a bad light." Dylan hesitated. "What exactly do you mean by counter?" Karen sighed. "Dylan, you know how this works. Walter's statement will frame the narrative. If there's a way to show you followed protocol, we need to lean on that." The words felt hollow to Dylan. Protocol or not, he knew in his gut that he'd crossed a line. "I'll be there," he muttered, ending the call. At the hospital, Walter sat upright in bed, his sling visible against his pajama shirt. Emily was by his side, her expression tense as they waited for the investigator. A knock on the door announced the arrival of Detective Susan Hart, a no-nonsense officer assigned to the case. "Mr. Briggs, Dr. Briggs," Hart greeted, pulling up a chair beside Walter's bed. "Thank you for speaking with me today." Walter nodded politely. Emily's posture was less welcoming. Hart began with basic questions about the incident, Walter's movements, his interaction with Dylan, and his recollection of the moment things escalated. "I told him I was on my way to the bus stop," Walter said calmly. "I even set my bag down when he asked. But before I could explain further, he pushed me." Emily couldn't contain herself. "He didn't just push you. He shoved you to the ground like you were a threat. You're a 68-year-old man, for God's sake." Walter placed a hand on her arm. "Emily, please." Hart looked between them. "Dr. Briggs, I understand this is personal for you, but I need to focus on the facts. Mr. Briggs, was there anything in your behavior that could have been misinterpreted as resistance?" Walter frowned thoughtfully. "I shifted my footing when he moved closer, but that was more out of reflex. I wasn't resisting him." Hart jotted down notes, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. Your statement will be included in the investigation. Dr. Briggs, do you have anything you'd like to add?" Emily's jaw tightened. "I want to make it clear that Officer Carter's actions were reckless and unjustified. My father could have been seriously injured, or worse. This isn't just about what happened that day. It's about accountability." Hart nodded, closing her notebook. "Understood. We'll be in touch if we need further details." As Hart left the room, Emily turned to her father. "I'm not letting this go, Dad. He needs to answer for what he did." Walter sighed deeply. "Emily, sometimes the best way to win is to show grace." Emily shook her head. "Not this time." Back at the precinct, Hart reported her findings to Captain Jensen. The preliminary interviews painted a picture that left little room for defense. Walter Briggs is cooperative, articulate, and has no prior record, Hart summarized. The video corroborates his statement. Carter's actions were excessive. Jensen pinched the bridge of her nose. And the public's already out for blood. The mayor's been calling non-stop. "We need Carter's testimony," Hart said. "But honestly, Captain, I don't see how this ends well for him." That evening, Dillon met Karen in her office to prepare for his upcoming interview. Karen laid out the strategy: stick to the facts, emphasize protocol, and avoid emotional responses. "They're going to ask why you felt compelled to escalate," Karen said, her tone firm. "You need to make it clear that you were prioritizing safety." Dillon leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "What if I wasn't?" Karen blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if I wasn't prioritizing safety? What if I was just reacting?" Dillon's voice cracked slightly. "I saw him, and I assumed the worst. That's not safety. That's bias." Karen's expression softened, but her professionalism remained intact. "Dillon, I understand what you're feeling, but this isn't the time to second-guess yourself. You're a good cop. This is about preserving your career." Dillon wasn't so sure anymore. As he left her office, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, his truth, might cost him more than his badge. At the hospital, Emily scrolled through her phone, researching legal options while Walter slept. The video of the incident was everywhere, and public outrage was growing. She found herself caught between two emotions: the need for justice and the nagging doubt about what justice even looked like in this situation. When Walter stirred, she set her phone down and leaned closer. "How are you feeling, Dad?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," he joked weakly. "But I'll live." Emily smiled faintly, her worry etched in her eyes. "I just want you to be okay." Walter placed his hand over hers. "I will be. But you, Emily, you need to find peace too." Dillon spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The investigation loomed over him, but what haunted him most was the realization that no protocol, no defense, could undo the damage he'd caused. He was beginning to wonder if he even deserved to wear the badge anymore. Dillon couldn't stop thinking about Walter Briggs. The image of the man crumpled on the pavement haunted him, but what stuck even more were the stories he'd uncovered about Walter's life. Dillon had always thought of his job as black and white, good guys, bad guys, but Walter's story was turning everything he believed upside down. It started with the articles he'd found online. Walter wasn't just another resident of the neighborhood, he was a pillar of the community. He'd been a teacher for 30 years at Lincoln High, a struggling inner-city school, where he'd taught history and coached basketball. His students had called him Coach Briggs, and many of them credited him with keeping them out of trouble and helping them graduate. Walter had retired a decade ago, but he hadn't slowed down. Instead, he'd poured his energy into mentoring kids at a local community center. One article featured quotes from several of those kids, now grown adults, who described Walter as the person who had believed in them when no one else did. Dillon couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know more. His suspension left him with plenty of time, so he decided to visit the community center where Walter had volunteered. Dressed in plain clothes, Dillon walked into the small, brightly lit building. The walls were covered in photos of smiling children and community events. A woman in her 50s greeted him at the front desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious but polite. "I'm here to ask about Walter Briggs," Dillon said, his voice low. I heard he spent a lot of time here." The woman's face softened. "Oh, Mr. Briggs. Everyone here loves him. He's been a big part of this place for years. Could you tell me more about him?" Dillon asked. The woman hesitated for a moment but then gestured toward a small room lined with chairs and a coffee maker. "Come on in. I'll tell you what I can." They sat down, and she began to talk about Walter's work at the center. He came here almost every day, rain or shine. He ran workshops on everything from job applications to conflict resolution. He had this way of connecting with people, especially the kids. They trusted him. She smiled wistfully. "There's one boy in particular, Jamal. He was on the edge of getting expelled from school a couple of years ago. Walter worked with him, kept him focused. Now Jamal's in his second year of college, studying engineering." Dylan felt a lump form in his throat. He'd assumed Walter was just another person passing through the neighborhood, but the man had left an undeniable mark on countless lives. That evening, Dylan sat in his car outside the hospital, unsure if he should go inside. He'd driven there impulsively, overwhelmed by everything he'd learned about Walter. A part of him wanted to see the man, to apologize right then and there, but he wasn't sure it was his place. He stayed in the car for nearly an hour before finally driving away. Inside the hospital, Emily sat with her father, sorting through a folder of documents Walter had asked her to bring from home. Among them were old photos, newspaper clippings, and certificates of recognition. Emily couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she read through them. "Dad, you never told me you got the Teacher of the Year award 3 times, she said, holding up one of the certificates. Walter chuckled. "Didn't think it was that important." "Not important?" Emily said incredulously. "Dad, you've done more for this city than most people could ever dream of." Walter shrugged modestly. "It's not about the awards, Em. It's about the kids. If even one of them remembers something I taught them and uses it to make their life better, then it was all worth it." Emily sat back, holding the certificate in her lap. "You're amazing, you know that?" Walter smiled, but his expression turned serious. "And you're angry," he said softly. Emily sighed, not bothering to deny it. "Of course I'm angry. That officer hurt you for no reason." "Emily," Walter began, but she cut him off. "No, Dad. Don't tell me to let it go. You always forgive people so easily, but this isn't something I can forgive." "Not yet." Walter reached for her hand. "Anger has its place, Em. But don't let it control you. It's a heavy burden to carry." Emily looked away, tears brimming in her eyes. She wanted to listen to her father, to let go of the anger that burned in her chest, but she couldn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, Dylan couldn't stop thinking about Walter's impact. He found himself revisiting the stories he'd heard at the community center and the articles he'd read online. The more he learned, the more he realized how far he'd fallen short of the values he thought he stood for as a police officer. One night, Dylan found himself going through his old things. At the bottom of a box, he found an old picture of himself with his high school basketball coach, a man who had kept him on track during his teenage years. Dylan had almost forgotten how much that coach had meant to him, how his guidance had shaped the person Dylan had become. Looking at the photo, Dylan realized something he hadn't allowed himself to admit before: Walter Briggs wasn't just a victim of his actions. He was someone who deserved his respect, someone Dylan owed far more than an apology. Dylan stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. His hair was slightly disheveled, and dark circles framed his eyes. For days, he'd been consumed by thoughts of Walter Briggs and the choices that had led to their fateful encounter. He felt hollow, like a stranger in his own skin. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to clear his head. He couldn't erase what he'd done, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to make amends. The following morning, Dylan drove back to the community center, clutching a stack of flyers he had hastily printed the night before. Each flyer contained information about a new initiative he wanted to launch: free workshops led by local police officers to foster better relationships with the community. He wasn't sure how it would be received, but he knew he had to start somewhere. When he walked into the center, the same woman from his last visit greeted him with a skeptical look. "Back again?" she asked, folding her arms. Yes, Dylan said, his voice steadier than he expected. I want to help. Her eyebrows lifted in surprise. Help? With what? Dylan handed her one of the flyers. I know I'm not exactly a welcome face right now, but I want to do something meaningful. Walter Briggs, he inspired this. I want to give back in a way that honors him. The woman studied the flyer, her expression softening slightly. You're serious about this? I am, Dylan replied firmly. I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm trying to change. And I thought this might be a good place to start. She considered his words for a moment before nodding. All right. Let's see what you can do. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood that Officer Dylan Carter, the man at the center of the Walter Briggs controversy, was trying to make amends. The response was mixed. Some saw it as a genuine attempt at redemption, while others dismissed it as a calculated move to save face. Despite the skepticism, Dylan threw himself into the project. He coordinated with other officers, organized events, and spent hours at the community center meeting residents. Slowly, he began to see a side of the community he'd overlooked for years, its strength, its resilience, and its humanity. One afternoon, as Dylan was setting up chairs for a workshop, he noticed a teenage boy lingering near the door. The boy wore a hoodie and kept his hands in his pockets, his posture guarded. Hey there, Dylan called out, keeping his tone light. You here for the workshop? The boy hesitated before stepping inside. Maybe. What's it about? Conflict resolution, Dylan said. You know, how to handle tough situations without letting things get out of control. The boy smirked. You think you're an expert on that? Dylan felt a pang of guilt but forced a small smile. Not yet. But I'm trying to learn. The boy shrugged and took a seat at the back of the room. Dylan didn't push him for more, but as the workshop began, he noticed the boy listening intently, his arms uncrossing as the session went on. Meanwhile, Emily was working late at the hospital when she received a text from one of her father's friends. It included a photo of Dylan at the community center, surrounded by kids and volunteers. The message read, "Looks like he's trying to make up for what he did. Thought you'd want to know." Emily stared at the photo for a long moment, her emotions swirling. She wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her wanted to dismiss Dylan's efforts as self-serving, but another part of her, the part that remembered how much her father believed in second chances, felt a flicker of hope. When she visited Walter the next day, she showed him the photo. What do you think, Dad? Is he sincere? Walter studied the image, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Time will tell, he said. But it's a step in the right direction. Dylan's workshops began to gain traction. More residents started showing up, and even some of his colleagues began to take notice. One evening, as he was packing up after a session, the teenage boy from earlier approached him. Hey, the boy said awkwardly. Thanks for, doing this. Dylan looked up, surprised. It's my pleasure. What's your name? Jamal, the boy muttered, glancing at the floor. Dylan's chest tightened. He remembered the story the woman at the community center had told him about a boy named Jamal who'd turned his life around with Walter's help. You knew Mr. Briggs, didn't you? Dylan asked. Jamal nodded. He was the best. Always had time for me, even when nobody else did. Dylan swallowed the lump in his throat. He's a great man. Jamal nodded again, his expression softening. Yeah. He is. As Jamal walked away, Dylan felt a surge of determination. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore, he was doing it for people like Jamal and, most importantly, for Walter. Despite the progress he was making, Dylan knew he couldn't avoid a confrontation with Emily forever. He had rehearsed what he wanted to say a dozen times in his head, but when the moment came, he still felt unprepared. He saw her leaving the hospital one evening and approached cautiously. Dr. Briggs, he called out. Emily turned, her expression guarded. Officer Carter, she said coolly. What do you want? Dylan hesitated, then took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize. Not just to your father, but to you. I know what I did was wrong, and I can't undo it. But I'm trying to make things right." Emily crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And you think running a few workshops is going to fix everything?" "No," Dylan admitted. "I don't. But it's a start." For a long moment, Emily said nothing. Then, with a sigh, she shook her head. "We'll see, Officer Carter. Actions speak louder than words." Dylan paced outside the hospital, rehearsing the words he planned to say to Walter. His conversation with Emily had left him feeling both humbled and determined. She was right, words alone weren't enough. But he couldn't move forward without facing Walter directly. The automatic doors slid open, and Dylan stepped into the brightly lit lobby. The receptionist directed him to Walter's room, her expression neutral, though Dylan could sense the recognition in her eyes. He adjusted the collar of his shirt and took a deep breath before knocking softly on the door. "Come in," Walter's voice called, faint but steady. Dylan pushed the door open. Walter was sitting upright in bed, his arms still in a sling, a book resting on his lap. He looked up, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Briggs," Dylan began, his voice low. "I'm Officer Carter. May I speak with you for a moment?" Walter nodded slowly. "You already came all this way. Might as well sit down." Dylan pulled up a chair, sitting with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Walter studied him, his gaze steady but not unkind. "I owe you an apology," Dylan finally said. "What I did to you was wrong. I made assumptions I shouldn't have, and I let those assumptions guide my actions. There's no excuse for it." Walter didn't respond immediately. He closed his book, setting it aside. "Why now?" he asked simply. Dylan swallowed hard. "Because I can't move forward without owning up to what I did. I've spent the past few weeks learning about you, your work, your impact on this community. I should have seen you for who you are that day, but I didn't. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." Walter leaned back against the pillows, his face contemplative. "You know, Officer Carter, I've had plenty of time to think about that day too. I keep asking myself why someone like you would react the way you did." Dylan's shoulders slumped. "I wish I could tell you it was a one-time mistake. But the truth is, it's something deeper, something I'm still trying to understand. I've started therapy, and I'm working to unlearn the biases I've carried for too long. It's not an easy process, but it's necessary." Walter regarded him silently for a moment before nodding. "Acknowledging it is the first step." "I want to do more than acknowledge it," Dylan said earnestly. "I've started community workshops to build better relationships between officers and residents. It's not enough to fix what I've done, but it's a start. And I want to do it in a way that honors you." Walter's expression softened slightly. "I've heard about those workshops. Jamal told me about them." Dylan blinked in surprise. "You know Jamal?" Walter chuckled. "Of course I do. That boy's practically family. I've been mentoring him since he was 13. Dylan felt a pang of shame, realizing how much he had underestimated Walter that day. "He spoke so highly of you. You've changed his life." "I've just given him a little guidance," Walter said modestly. "The rest is up to him." As they talked, Dylan felt the tension in the room begin to ease. Walter's voice remained calm and steady, but there was an unmistakable strength in his words. "You've got a lot to make up for, Officer Carter," Walter said. "But I believe people can change if they're willing to put in the work." "I am," Dylan said firmly. Walter gave him a small, thoughtful nod. "Then show me." The next morning, Emily arrived at the hospital to check on her father. She was surprised to find him sitting by the window, looking more energized than he had in weeks. "You're up early," Emily said, setting her bag down on the chair. Walter turned to her with a smile. "I had a visitor yesterday. Officer Carter." Emily stiffened. "He came here? What did he want?" He wanted to apologize, Walter said. And I believe he was sincere. Emily frowned, crossing her arms. Do you think that's enough? An apology doesn't erase what he did. No, it doesn't, Walter agreed. But it's a step in the right direction. And I told him the same thing I'll tell you, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means giving someone a chance to do better. Emily looked away, her jaw tight. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Walter reached for her hand. You don't have to be. Forgiveness is a process, just like change. But don't let your anger weigh you down, Em. It's a heavy burden to carry. Emily sighed, squeezing his hand. I'll try, Dad. For you. That evening, Dylan attended another workshop at the community center. The room was full, a mix of curious residents and off-duty officers. As the session began, Dylan felt a strange but welcome sense of purpose. He glanced toward the door and saw a familiar figure walk in, Emily. She stood near the back, her arms crossed but her expression less guarded than before. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave him a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Dylan sat at his kitchen table, the dim glow of a single lamp illuminating the clutter of papers spread out before him. Flyers for upcoming workshops, handwritten notes from the community, and police department policy manuals sat in uneven stacks. Despite the strides he'd made, doubt still lingered, gnawing at the edges of his determination. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his mother's number. It had been a while since they'd spoken, and he felt a sudden need to hear her voice. Dylan, she answered after the first ring, her voice warm but tinged with surprise. It's been a minute. Everything okay? Dylan exhaled. Yeah, Mom. I wanted to talk. About what? She asked, a note of concern creeping in. Do you remember Dr. Briggs? The one who helped you when you had that heart attack? Of course I do, his mother said, her tone softening. Why do you ask? Dylan hesitated before replying. Her father is the man from the incident. Walter Briggs. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Oh, Dylan, his mother finally said, her voice heavy with understanding. I didn't realize. I didn't either, at first, Dylan admitted. But now I can't stop thinking about it. About how much I owe both of them. His mother's voice grew firm. Dylan, you can't change the past, but you can decide how it shapes your future. Dr. Briggs saved my life that night, and you have a chance to honor her and her father by doing the right thing. I'm trying, Dylan said quietly. I really am. His mother's tone softened again. I know, honey. And I'm proud of you for that. But remember, redemption isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about building something better. The conversation stayed with Dylan long after they hung up. He thought about his mother's words as he prepared for the next workshop, and as he drove to the community center that evening, they echoed in his mind. The session was packed again, with familiar faces and a few new ones. Dylan noticed Emily standing near the back, her posture still guarded but slightly more relaxed than before. As the workshop ended, she approached him, her expression unreadable. You're really committed to this, aren't you? She asked. I am, Dylan replied. But I know it's not enough. I just hope it's a start. Emily studied him for a moment before nodding. It is. But it's going to take time. Dylan nodded in agreement. I'm willing to put in the time. A few days later, Dylan received an unexpected call from Emily. My father wants to see you, she said, her tone neutral. Really? Dylan asked, surprised. Yes, Emily replied. He said he has something he wants to share with you. Can you meet us at the hospital tomorrow? I'll be there, Dylan said without hesitation. The following afternoon, Dylan arrived at Walter's hospital room, his nerves buzzing. Walter was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than the last time Dylan had seen him. Emily stood nearby, her arms crossed but her expression calm. Officer Carter, Walter said, motioning for Dylan to sit. "Mr. Briggs," Dylan replied, taking the chair next to the bed. Walter smiled faintly. "I've been thinking a lot about second chances. About how they're not given lightly, and how they're earned over time. And I want to give you a chance to earn mine." Dylan's throat tightened. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs. That means more than I can say." Walter nodded, then reached for a worn leather folder on the bedside table. "I want to share something with you. It's a letter my wife wrote years ago, not long before she passed. She was a teacher too, like me, and she believed in people's ability to change." Walter handed the folder to Dylan, who opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink slightly faded but the words clear. "The most powerful thing we can do is to meet hatred with compassion, and ignorance with understanding. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with one person choosing to do better, and inspiring others to do the same." Dylan read the letter twice, the words sinking deep into his chest. He looked up at Walter, his voice thick with emotion. "This is powerful. Thank you for sharing it with me." Walter smiled gently. "Take those words to heart, Officer Carter. And use them to guide your path forward." That evening, Dylan returned home and pinned the letter to the wall above his desk. It became a daily reminder of the work he still had to do, and the legacy he hoped to honor. Meanwhile, Emily sat with her father, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She wasn't ready to forgive Dylan completely, but seeing him with her father had planted a seed of something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. Dylan stood outside the hospital's main entrance, clutching a small notebook in his hands. The pages were filled with plans for future workshops, ideas for improving communication between officers and the community, and notes about what he'd learned from Walter's story. But today wasn't about planning or workshops, it was about making good on a promise to himself and to Walter. Inside Walter's hospital room, Emily was helping her father adjust his pillows when Dylan knocked on the doorframe. Emily turned to see him, her expression carefully neutral. "Come in," Walter said warmly, motioning Dylan forward. Dylan stepped into the room, his nerves visible in the stiffness of his posture. "Mr. Briggs, Dr. Briggs," he greeted, his voice steady but low. "Thank you for seeing me again." Emily stayed silent, moving to stand near the window as Dylan pulled up a chair next to Walter's bed. The older man studied Dylan with the same calm intensity he always had, his eyes sharp and full of wisdom. "Officer Carter," Walter began, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the last time we talked. About how you're working to change." Dylan nodded. "I am. And I know it's not enough to just say it, I need to show it, every day." Walter smiled faintly. "That's good to hear. Because words only go so far." He shifted slightly, wincing as he adjusted his injured arm. "I've seen a lot of people promise to change, but very few follow through." Dylan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "Mr. Briggs, I want you to know that this isn't just about my career or clearing my name. Meeting you, learning about everything you've done for this community, has changed the way I see the world. The way I see myself. I can't undo what I did, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to be better." Walter's gaze softened, and for a moment, there was a heavy silence in the room. Then, he nodded. "I believe you, Officer Carter. But believing in someone doesn't mean letting them off the hook. You still have a long way to go." "I know," Dylan said earnestly. "And I'm ready for that." Emily, who had been quietly listening by the window, finally spoke. "It's not just about you, Officer Carter. What you did to my father, what you represent to so many people in this community, has left a mark that won't disappear overnight. You need to understand that." Dylan turned to face her, his expression serious. "I do. And I'm not asking for forgiveness, not yet. I'm asking for the chance to earn it." Emily's eyes softened, though her posture remained guarded. "Then prove it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Dylan. The workshops at the community center continued to grow, attracting not only residents but also fellow officers who were curious about his efforts. Dylan worked tirelessly, often staying late to listen to community members' concerns and brainstorm solutions with his colleagues. Word of his work began to spread. A local journalist attended one of the workshops and wrote a piece about the initiative, framing it as a story of redemption and reconciliation. While some readers praised Dylan's efforts, others remained skeptical, questioning whether his motives were genuine. Dylan didn't let the criticism deter him. He knew he couldn't control how others perceived him, only how he acted moving forward. One Saturday afternoon, Dylan found himself at the community center, helping set up for a special event, a celebration honoring Walter Briggs. The idea had come from Jamal, who had insisted that Walter's contributions to the neighborhood deserved recognition. Dylan had thrown himself into organizing the event, determined to make it a success. As the room filled with friends, family, and former students, Walter arrived, escorted by Emily. A wave of applause greeted him, and Dylan felt a swell of pride as he watched Walter take his place at the front of the room. Jamal stood up to speak first, sharing a heartfelt story about how Walter had mentored him through some of the darkest times in his life. Others followed, recounting similar tales of Walter's kindness, wisdom, and unwavering support. When it was Dylan's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment before stepping up to the microphone. The room grew quiet as all eyes turned to him. "I'm not here as a police officer today," Dylan began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm here as someone who's been deeply impacted by Mr. Briggs's story. Over the past few weeks, I've learned more about what it means to serve a community than I did in all my years on the force. And that's because of him." He turned to Walter, his expression earnest. "Mr. Briggs, your strength, your grace, and your commitment to making this world a better place have inspired me to be better, not just as an officer, but as a person. Thank you for showing me what true leadership looks like." The room erupted into applause, and Walter gave Dylan a small nod, his eyes shining with emotion. As the event wound down, Dylan found himself standing near the exit, watching as guests mingled and said their goodbyes. Emily approached him, her expression unreadable. "You did good today," she said, her tone soft. "Thank you," Dylan replied. "But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning." Emily studied him for a long moment before offering a small, tentative smile. "Then keep going. And don't stop." "I won't," Dylan promised. That night, Dylan sat at his desk, looking at the letter from Walter's wife. The words felt even more poignant now, a reminder of the path he had chosen to take. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt like he was heading in the right direction. Months had passed since the celebration for Walter Briggs, but its impact lingered in the hearts of everyone who had attended, none more so than Dylan. His work in the community had grown from a single workshop to a series of programs aimed at fostering dialogue, trust, and understanding between the police force and the residents they served. Every day was a challenge, but Dylan embraced it. He no longer saw his badge as a shield of authority, it was a symbol of responsibility, a commitment to protect and serve in the truest sense of the words. One bright morning, Dylan pulled into the parking lot of the community center, where a small crowd had gathered. It was the first day of a new mentorship program, one Dylan had modeled after Walter's approach with the youth in the neighborhood. He carried a box of materials inside, greeted warmly by Jamal, who had volunteered to help run the program. "You ready for this?" Jamal asked, his grin wide. "As ready as I'll ever be," Dylan replied, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. The program began with a circle of young participants, teenagers with wary eyes and folded arms. Dylan started by sharing his own story, speaking openly about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned. It wasn't easy to bare his soul, but he knew it was the only way to earn their trust. By the end of the session, some of the teens had opened up, sharing their own fears and frustrations about the world they lived in. Dylan listened intently, taking notes and promising to bring their concerns to his precinct. "Thank you," one of the boys muttered as he left, his voice barely audible. Dylan smiled, knowing it was a small but meaningful victory. Later that afternoon, Dylan drove to Walter's house. Walter had been released from the hospital weeks ago and was recovering well, though he still moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had been through more than his share of hardships. Dylan knocked on the door, and Walter answered, his face lighting up when he saw him. "Officer Carter," Walter said, stepping aside to let him in. "Just Dylan," he replied with a sheepish grin. Walter chuckled. "All right, Dylan. What brings you here today?" "I wanted to give you something," Dylan said, pulling a folder from his bag. "It's the plan for the mentorship program. It's based on what you've been doing for years, your way of teaching, mentoring, and inspiring. I thought it was only right to share it with you." Walter opened the folder, scanning the contents with a thoughtful expression. This is good," he said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "You've taken what I started and made it into something bigger." "You started this," Dylan said firmly. "I'm just carrying it forward." Walter smiled, his eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you, Dylan. And I think my wife would be too." A week later, Dylan stood in front of a packed room at City Hall, addressing members of the community, local leaders, and police officers. He had been invited to speak about his journey and the changes he hoped to inspire. "My story isn't unique," Dylan began, his voice steady. "It's a story of mistakes, of bias, and of harm caused by assumptions I didn't even realize I was carrying. But it's also a story of growth, of listening, and of choosing to do better." He glanced at the audience, spotting Walter and Emily in the front row. Walter gave him an encouraging nod, while Emily's expression softened into a small smile. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Dylan continued. "It happens in moments, in conversations, in small acts of kindness, and in the willingness to admit when we've been wrong. I stand here today not as someone who's finished learning, but as someone who's just begun." The room erupted into applause, and Dylan stepped back from the podium, his heart swelling with gratitude. As the event ended, Dylan found himself surrounded by people offering words of encouragement and thanks. Among them was Emily, who approached him with a determined look in her eyes. "You're doing good work, Dylan," she said. "Thank you," he replied. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "And for what it's worth, I forgive you." Dylan's breath caught, and he felt an unexpected surge of emotion. "Thank you, Emily. That means more than I can say. It's what my dad would want," she said with a faint smile. "And, honestly, it's what I needed too." That night, Dylan returned home, exhausted but deeply fulfilled. He pinned a new flyer to the wall above his desk, a schedule for the next series of workshops. Below it hung Walter's wife's letter, its words etched into Dylan's mind. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with one person choosing to do better and inspiring others to do the same." Dylan smiled, feeling the weight of the words and the truth they carried. He wasn't perfect, and he never would be. But he was trying. And in trying, he was creating a new purpose, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Redemption wasn't a finish line. It was a path, winding and difficult, but worth every step.